Hey guys, just a quick video today showing you guys a preview of the upcoming new features for the procedural foliage placement tool update that's coming in next week. I've already shown you guys some of the physical material spawning on a previous video, but I figured now that I can actually speak, I can give you a quick preview of some of the other features as well. So the first thing I wanted to show you guys is a way to bypass the collision of the meshes. And that will allow you to spawn meshes in a much more dense way. And actually, this was added last minute. You actually already have this feature, but I didn't get a chance to record a tutorial on it. So let me show you what it is. It's super simple. But right now, all I'm going to do is try to spawn about 4,000 trees in this really tiny area here, which obviously means that I'm not going to spawn that many trees. So if I go ahead and click spawn actors, you'll see that I got quite a few trees here. Let me just move this up. But as you can see, there's still some area in between the trees, right? So this is the normal behavior, right? It just picks a random location and tries to spawn it, but it respects the boundaries of the trees that you've given it here in the collision bounds. Now if I go ahead and select the option down here, it says ignore foliage collision, and select it here, and let's see what happens when I try again. So I'm going to go ahead and remove everything and spawn the actors now. Now you can see that is super dense, right? Literally, there's trees right next to each other, even overlapping a little bit, because again, this is basically ignoring the actual bounds that you set for the collision, and just spawning as many foliage in that area as possible. Now obviously you probably wouldn't want to do that with trees. As you can see, you can barely see anything. But if you have anything that lacks collision, right, any little shrubs or rocks or even grass, right? You could use this to spawn grass on a non-terrain, right, on a regular mesh. Then you could probably use this option if you wanted a lot of density, right? You will get a little bit of overlap, but again, it's just one more option for you to obviously control how you spawn your meshes. So all it takes from what you saw there from now is literally just this checkbox that says ignore foliage collision. And that's off by default, obviously, because we do want to respect the collision. But again, just one more option for you guys. You've seen the physical material. This is a separate file that you create, and you can use it on landscape layers. In this case, the soil layer is already has it as a property, but you can use it on literally any mesh, right? So a physical material can be added to any mesh in addition to the regular material, and then you would just assign the physical material here. And the way you would do it is here, you would say spawn only on this physical materials. And notice that this is an array, meaning that you can have more than one physical material, right? So you could have a material for grass, for ground, for dirt, whatever, and you can mix and match what physical materials will be allowed for your trees or your foliage to spawn. So in this case, let's just quickly show you. Let's just add a physical material, and let's do soil. And you can see I have a few here that I've been testing. This is going to get cleaned up, obviously, but I'm just going to use soil. And I'm going to expand the radius here. Let's just make it 400 by 400 to make sure that we cover everything. And then just like you saw on the previous video, if I just go ahead and click spawn, it'll only spawn in the area where the actual soil layer is. And you notice that there is a little bit of skirting here, and that's because when I painted, I didn't have the tool strength to 100%. So there is a limitation, obviously, on the landscape. But when I do the ray trace, it's whatever information I'm getting back at the hit location, right? So again, the example I'm using here is just the landscape, but any physical material will work in this case. So, all right, let's go ahead and take that out. We don't need the physical material here, and of course, as soon as I do that, if I click spawn actors, then of course now it just spawns pretty much everywhere. The other feature that is super simple, but it was actually the first one I added, was the ability to scale the individual meshes by axes. So on the version that you have right now, you do have a minimum range and a maximum range for scale. And it was basically a 2D vector. And I changed that to having two full vector trees, a minimum scale and a maximum scale, which means that now for every individual axis, you can actually have a minimum and a maximum, right? So if I wanted to scale only on the Z axis, I could say, for example, from 0.5 to, I don't know, for let's say 2, just to make it really obvious here. And then I'm going to leave the X and the Y the same for the scaling. And I just go here and spawn actors. And you can see now that you see now that you have trees that are very short compared to trees that are very long, right? And you can see here, excellent example here. Look at this tiny one, look at this big one, right? So now you can have a lot more variation as you're spawning your trees. Again, this seems pretty logical, right, in hindsight, but for some reason, when I was creating the tool, I figured you want a uniform scale. But that's not necessarily the case, right? You could also do, you know, for whatever reason, in the x-axis or the y-axis, right? So I could do something, I'm just gonna exaggerate it from like between 1 and 5 in the x only, right? And I just click on spawn actors, and there we go. And you can see that it kind of looks ridiculous. You know, it's like very wide in the x-axis, but kind of like that on the y-axis. So you can see here that trees look absolutely ridiculous, but it's just to show you that you can actually scale the meshes in any of the 3 axes as you want. And obviously you want to be subtle, right? The whole point is that you want to have some values that are subtle, right? Instead of, you know, 1 1, you might want to, you know, change it by about 10 to 15 to 20% in each axis, and that should actually give the trees quite a bit of variation. So again, super simple change, but again, gives you a lot more flexibility. And the last change I'm going to include in the 1.1 release is actually related to runtime spawning, right? I've had a few people message me over Discord asking how good is the tool for runtime spawning, right? It's great that you can do it in editor, but if you have a dynamically created landscape, right? There are some tools out there that allow you to do that. Can you spawn the trees dynamically while while you play the game at runtime? And technically you can, but the problem is that right now, or well, actually not right now because I just fixed it, but on the version that you have, it would spawn all of the trees at one go, right? So if you wanted to spawn 5,000 trees, it'll just loop through the algorithm 5,000 times, and that obviously hits your frame rate quite a bit, right? So especially if you're doing runtime spawning, you would see a huge dip on your frame rate, and obviously that's not good. So what I did was I implemented a batching system, and you've seen this before if you've seen my videos on the procedural city generator, where if you have a mega city, you don't want to spawn thousands of buildings at a time, right? So you would actually see, as I'm clicking the blutility, how I would just go through, and doing in batches. So I used a similar approach here, and now you'll see that there's a new section called batch details, and right now the default batch size is 5,000, right? But you can change this to whatever you want, right? So right now I'm trying to spawn 4,000 trees, and the batch size is 5,000, which means that when I hit spawn actors, it'll spawn everything at one go. And you can see that it still took a little bit of time, maybe half a second, to spawn all of the trees, right? But you can see what happens if I turn on the messaging, which now I have a new boolean here, show messages, and I'm going to turn that on, and I'm going to change the batch size to, let's say, 1,000. And now if I click spawn actors, you'll see that it says it actually spawned 491 and the batch between 0 and 9999. So as I am clicking the spawn actors, you'll see that now it's actually cycling through all of the batches until it's finished, right? So normally if you're doing it in editor like I'm doing it here, you probably wouldn't care about the batch unless you're spawning hundreds of thousands of hierarchical instance static meshes. So again, this is useful in editor if you're trying to spawn grass, for example, right? On a landscape, you can just use the grass node like I'm using here in the material. But if you had an actual mesh and you wanted to spawn grass all over the place, you would change the number, here from whatever to like 100,000. At that point, you probably want to make sure that you use batching, maybe every 5,000 or every 10,000 or whatever, to make sure that your computer doesn't literally hang, right? Your editor as it's going through the loop 100,000 times, right? So that's one use case. But the more interesting one is runtime, right? So here's what I'm going to show you. I've created a little blueprint here, and I call it runtime spawn. It's super simple. But all this does is it grabs a reference to a spawner that's in the level. It asks you which type of spawning do you want to do, whether it's an actor or instance static mesh, and the spawn index, which obviously corresponds to exactly what you would see here, right? So you would either get an actors list or a instance static mesh list, and then you'll have the index either for the actor or the instance static mesh, right, in that array. So basically, you would set up your spawner just the way you have it here, and then you would decide exactly what foliage type do you want to spawn when the player overlaps with the trigger. And right now I'm saying I want to spawn actors index 0. So if I were to hit play here, and notice my frame rate here, as soon as I hit the overlap, you can see that my frame rate dropped a little bit, but 4 batches were spawned. So what happens if I actually make this a little bit smaller? So I'm going to change this from 4,000 trees, let's just do 5,000, but the batch size is going to be 100. Now notice what happens on the frame rate as I overlap the trigger. Notice that the spawner is slowly going and spawning batch by batch, and my frame rate at that point isn't taking that big a hit, right? And in this case, the reason you're seeing the frame rate go down is because I'm actually spawning individual actors, right? So for performance, you want to make sure that you spawn hierarchical instance static meshes, which of course you can, and that's exactly what I'm going to show you right now. So here you would change it to hierarchical instance static meshes, index 0, and if you look at what we have in index 0, is just basically 10,000 trees. They're going to be the snow type. And actually, let's just change the collision type here. 491, 454, and 1012. And the batch size is still 100. Okay. Now notice what happens on the frame rate. I'm going through all of the batches at runtime, and you can see that because they're instance static meshes, even though I have 10,000 trees that are still spawning, by the way, my frame rate is still pretty decent, right? Obviously, it's still gonna get a hit, but it's not, if I would try to do this with individual actors, it would basically tank my frame rate to something like 20 frames per second or something. So this is just a way, and it's still going, by the way, this is just a way of using the tool to spawn trees at runtime. So this is obviously super obvious because it's right in front of the player, but the way you would use it is you would have trees that are really far in the distance spawn, or if they're out of line of sight, you would have them spawn, right? And then see that as soon as I click, they go away. So all of these changes are coming. The batching is really neat because again, it helps you spawn hundreds of thousands of meshes without, hanging your editor. And if you wanted to do runtime spawning, the use case that I would use is what you just saw here. You would decrease the timer. You would decrease the batch size, and you have the timer here. Every half a second, it'll spawn 100. So you can play with this number. This is also very useful if you have individual blueprint actors, right? That you cannot have as hierarchical instance static meshes. So in the case of the changing tree, if I go ahead and change it to the changing tree, this is basically the blueprint that I included that changes color as you approach it. I'm going to change it to maybe like 500. Even 500 of these will actually impact performance in your level. So another useful use case is if you have a blueprint that's really heavy, you probably only want to spawn it when the player is getting close, and maybe destroy it or despawn it when the player gets far. So yet again, instead of having it always on your level taking resources, what you can do is when the player gets close, then you can spawn it. And here's the last example I'll show you guys. As I'm going here, you'll see that now I am spawning all of the different blueprints, and these look like regular trees, but when I get close, notice that the color changes. This is an actual blueprint actor class. And these, of course, you cannot turn into instance static meshes because obviously they have components like the little dynamic material. There's a I think it's a sphere overlap, and you can see the little particle effects as you get close. So what I would say is runtime spawning is great if you want to spawn individual actor blueprints that are heavy and you want to do it when the player gets close, or if you want to have a lot of instance static meshes and you just want them to spawn when the player gets close. And obviously if you have runtime generation of terrain, then this would also be helpful. All right, that's pretty much it, guys. I had something else in mind, but it turned out to be a bit more complicated. So I'm going to postpone the other idea that I've had for a future update. But right now, what's coming in 1.1 is physical material. Now you can specifically select one or more physical materials for each individual foliage type. You have an ability to pack even more meshes into the same area by ignoring the bounds, the foliage bounds, foliage collision. You can now scale your meshes individually on all three axes, which allows you to add a lot more variety. Now I've added a batching system for when you want to spawn hundreds of thousands of instance static meshes, great for foliage or bushes or rocks, things that don't have a lot of collision. And you can use the example blueprint here to see how I'm basically calling a custom event on the spawner to basically run a timer on the spawning algorithm and then spawn your blueprints or your instance static meshes during runtime. All right, hopefully you like all of the new additions that are coming. I still have a bit of testing to do before I'm ready to submit to Epic, and I want to create a new map where I'm basically showcasing what I showed you now, but in a nicer way, right? And then after that's done, I will go ahead and submit to Epic. So I expect you guys to get this new update by mid next week, hopefully. So let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you in the next video. Thanks a lot.